Hey guys, welcome back to the Chess Basics YouTube channel, and today I will be filming the part 2 of this 2-part mini-series about how to play chess. So, I will be showing today the basic tactics and what you should probably try to do in your chess games to win material and games. So, first thing is pins. Pins are where, like, a piece like this bishop is pinning this knight to the king. The knight cannot move because you cannot put yourself into check. As well as this rook is pinning this knight to the king, and this rook is pinning this pawn to the king. Any piece can be pinned, whether it's a pawn, a knight, bishop, pawn, or queen, whatever. You can't pin a king to anything because that would be check. It's a different tactic that I'll talk about later. But anyway, so none of these pieces can move in this situation, and I'll show you how pins can be helpful in game. So here is the first situation that I have. So if it's black to move, you think, oh, well, black can just take this free bishop. Well, then white can play this. And now the rook is pinning the queen to the king. And even though black got a free bishop, a queen is worth 9, and then a rook and a bishop are worth 8 together. So the queen either is just lost, or the queen would take the rook, which loses a point of material. Even though technically black is winning in this position, I just put random pieces here. But so pinning pieces of higher value is very helpful in game. So pinning the queen to the king, using a bishop to pin a queen to a king, using a bishop to pin a rook to the king or queen, I guess. Then, so try to pin higher value pieces to the king so they are forced to take, or you'll take them. So, yeah. And then I'll show you one more scenario like an actual game. So start with e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, bishop to c4, knight to f6, d3, g6, bishop to g5, bishop to g7, castle, d4. So this is a key move. You might think, oh, well, that's just trading a pawn off. But so if black plays e takes d4, then instead of taking back, you actually want to play e5. So this bishop is pinning this knight to the queen. So if you move this knight here, then that's losing material because then the bishop will take the queen. So there's nothing you can do about this pawn. I mean, I guess what you can do is you can play knight takes, but then knight takes there. So that's just winning a piece for a pawn. So try to get into the situations where you can have a pawn attacking a piece that's pinned. That can be very helpful in games. Or even having a pin and then you have other pieces attacking it. In this case, there are this bishop defending and the queen defending, but you can maybe try to get more pieces attacking than defending and just win a piece. I think I'll have another scenario like that. Anyways, I think that is all for pins. So now I will be talking about skewers. So in this position at first it looks like black is completely lost. He has a bishop for a queen, but there is a move that actually wins for black, which is bishop to b5 check. And in this position, the king has to move, but then now the bishop takes the queen. This is called a skewer, where you have, let me just do this, like a piece behind the king where the king has to move out of the way somewhere, and then that piece is lost. So if you have like this position where maybe it's a bishop check, and then the bishop would take the queen, or maybe you could have a position where it's like this, and the rook would be able to take the queen, something like that. So that's basic skewer. So yeah, another example of skewer doesn't even have to be a higher piece, but this king cannot get back and defend this bishop, so that's just winning a piece. Then, so this is an interesting position. So at first, black looks very solid, and that there's really nothing white can do. White can maybe try to attack this rook, and then force it to lose the knight, but you can actually just straight up, oops, I did not mean to do that. You can just straight up take this knight with the rook, and you're like, well, that's losing material, because then black just takes the rook back. But there's actually this move, which skewers the king to the queen. So then the king's only move is back here, and then you lose the queen. So look out for like a little bit more complex tactics like that, because especially at the beginning level, it's important to learn that you can have pieces guard. So like this, the only thing guarding this skewer is this rook. So if you force the rook to move, then you can do that. So that is all for skewers. So now I will be explaining forks, and I will start with a knight fork. So a fork is when a piece attacks two or more other pieces, enemy pieces, at once. So a fork can consist of a lot of things. So it could be like not even a king. This is a fork. This is a fork. Anywhere where for knight forks, anywhere a piece can be here, and where the knight cannot be attacked is a fork. So, and you can fork any pieces, like could be even this. So this is a fork, even though it might not win material because the queen could just do this. But so yeah, so forks are like this. So usually you want to fork like a rook or a queen, or rook, queen, king, or king and queen. So anything that'll win material, since if you fork like a king and a rook, which is probably most common in game for knights, is if you fork a king and a knight, then you can win material. Since a rook is worth 5, a knight is only worth 3, you just, because it's in check, then you do that. That's winning 5 points of material, because the king can't even take back in this scenario. Sometimes if a piece can take back, even if they take back, it's still winning 2 points of material, which is still good. So forks can be very beneficial in game. So I'll show an example of that. So start like e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, bishop to c4, knight to f6, knight to c3, bishop to c5, d3, e7, or queen to e7, sorry, knight to b5, oh, not that move, b6. So if you're just nonchalant moving this pawn, then you have knight takes c7 check. So that forks the king and the rook. So this is probably the most common fork, is for a knight to take this pawn and fork the king and the rook. So then the king would have to go here, and then you just take the rook, and you're up 5 points of material. Your knight will probably get trapped because in one move you have this, but still you won material, and then you can even just take this pawn since your knight is lost. It's trapped. Because if knight goes here, it gets taken. Knight goes here, it gets taken, or by the bishop, and those are the only two moves. So you can just take another pawn, whatever, and then you're up like 6 points of material overall. Because your opponent has a weak file over here, like potentially you could take this rook down here and attack that way. You could, also you're just up a knight for a rook, you have that. So forks can be very beneficial in many ways. So I'll show you other examples of forks. So this is a fork because yeah, it's a piece that's attacking two other pieces, and they can't protect both of them. And so there are many examples of fork. So that's with a rook, like a queen. You can fork a king and a queen this way. You can fork pieces in so many ways with a queen. Like, anywhere you attack more than one piece. So this, it's like forking everything, because you can attack ever. So even if you think, oh, well, like, maybe I just can't get forks in my games or something, even this could be a fork. If you want to force a queen trade, then you can have that. And so if they move their king, then you just get a free queen. So instead, what they have to do is you force a trade, which forcing trades can be beneficial if you're up pieces or pawns or whatever. So yeah, that's another way to fork. And this is forking with a bishop. So, and you're like, oh, what, you could just defend the knights. But then the bishop still hits the rook. So in this scenario, there's no way to defend the knights. Either way, the bishop still guards the squares. But yeah, so that's another way to fork. So you can fork with any piece. And spotting them in game can be difficult, but I'll show you ways to be able to spot forks and pins and skewers easier. So that is all for forks, but I will show you the next tactic. So now I will show a tactic called a discovered attack. So discovered attacks don't happen that often in game. They are a lot more rare than the other tactics, but they are still incredibly useful to know. So a game could start like e4, e5, queen to h5, knight to c6, because you don't want to hang this pawn, bishop to c4, threatening checkmate. So, and then g6, because now this pawn is not hanging, queen to h3. So now this is a blunder. So first you might be like, why? Because you have pawn to d5, or just d5, and you're like, but that's a free pawn. Pawn is guarding the bishop. But it's not exactly a free pawn, because since this pawn is moved, the bishop attacks the queen. So you have two pieces under attack now. The queen can't take the bishop because queen and rook guard. So now the queen has to move, but then you just lose your bishop. So attacking two pieces at once with a discovered attack is very useful, because you're like guaranteed to win a piece if you do it correctly. So now it's just down a piece for a pawn. So for white. So that's just a really useful tactic. Like, also, it doesn't have to happen with the bishop. Even though it's most likely to happen with the bishop, you can also have like a different piece in front of the bishop here, and then you move that piece and attack another one. Or you move a piece and then it's check, and then you're attacking a piece. So if you have like, even if you're like, so if this is check for whatever reason, that's not a king obviously, but if the king was over here, then there's nothing, then you'd lose your queen for sure. So especially if you do a discovered attack, and then it's check, then that's just very, very good for you, not for your opponent. So, and then another example would be this position, where see if you can spot the discovered attack. Give you a few seconds. So the discovered attack from this position is pawn up to f4. So f4. So now the queen has to move out of danger, but then you hang a rook, so then that's plus 5 points of material. So yeah, there's really nothing black can do in this scenario, because you lose one piece one way or the other, and queen is worth more. So this is just completely winning for white. So that's all really for discovered attacks. There's not all that much you can do unless you start something called a windmill, which I might explain in a more advanced tactic, but in a more advanced tactics video. But for now, that's what a discovered attack is. So now I will be showing you basic checkmating patterns. So this is to help you find checkmates easily if you don't know really what to do to get to checkmate. So let's say this scenario where just white takes your bishop. So you might think, oh well, that's just losing a bishop. But then black has checkmate, which you're like, oh well, here the king can't go anywhere. If it goes here, it gets taken. Goes the other way, it gets taken. So the pawns are just blocking and the rook can't do anything. So this is called back rank mate, where the king is just blocked off by his pawns here, and he cannot go anywhere, and you either back rank with a rook or a queen. So that's a checkmate that you'll see a lot, because if you castle and then this rook that ends up right here gets moved, and then it's just left with this, then yeah, that would be back rank mate. So another common checkmate I will show is called, I wouldn't say this is really common, but this is just something to watch out for. This is called fool's mate. This is the fastest way to get checkmated, and I say never do this. This is the worst thing you can do in chess. So it would be f3, which is already just losing for white because it doesn't do anything. It doesn't take the center at all. It doesn't, it doesn't really do much of anything. Because in openings of chess, the whole point really is to take the center or make your king really safe. This just really isn't smart in the first place, and it ends in checkmate. So e5, because this is good because it takes the center. But then if you play g4, then black has checkmate in 1, which is queen to here. None of these pieces can do anything. The knight is completely stuck. There is the only move which doesn't block it. The king can't move anywhere, so that's just checkmate, this is called fool's mate. So it's kind of what you can tell by its name that you don't want to play it. So this checkmate is called the legal's mate, which this is not very common. And also I highly do not suggest trying this, because if your opponent knows what they're doing, then you're just completely losing. So it starts with e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, bishop to c4, d6, knight to c3, bishop to g4, knight takes e5. So black could be like, oh, that's just a free queen. But if they take your queen, then it's checkmate in 2. Bishop takes f7 check, which the king's only move is forward because the knight is guarding the bishop. Even though it's hanging, the king still can't take the bishop because it's still guarded, because the knight's still there. And then knight to d5, checkmate. King can't go here because of this knight. King can't move forward because of the bishop. King can't move here because of this knight, and king cannot move back because of this. And you cannot block a knight check because knights can jump over pieces. So that is the legal's mate. You're like, oh wow, that looks really powerful. But really, after knight takes here, if black just takes your knight here, then they're just completely and utterly winning, because your queen's hanging, it's being attacked, because the knight guard's here, and then the knight's also attacking the bishop, so you just lost a piece, and then the only move now is this, that doesn't lose another piece. So this is why I don't suggest it, because if they don't take your queen and they just take back the knight, then it's just completely lost. So watch out for that, though. If someone plays this against you, just take back the knight, which they wouldn't expect maybe, and then you're just completely winning. So another checkmate that you might run into is called, this is a version of the scholar's mate. So you'd have e4, e5, queen to h5, knight to c6, bishop to c4, knight to f6, queen takes f7, checkmate. So this is actually a very effective checkmating pattern for beginners as long as on the first move, if they just immediately try to kick out your queen with this, then you have a king and rook fork, winning material. And if they just play knight up, then they still just lose a pawn, and you're just winning in that case, just hanging a pawn. So a lot of the time they can just play that. So, but this works very well because then they're like, oh, so this pawn's safe now. Let me just attack their queen. But then, yeah, it's checkmate. So this can be very useful, but once you get past the beginner level, then a lot of people know how to counter this by either, instead of playing, because then they'll play this, and then you can't do this anymore because the knight's guarding or something, so they'll know what to do higher level, but this is very good for beginner level. So the final basic checkmating pattern is called the smothered mate. So white actually has mate in one here, which is knight to f7 checkmate. So there's nothing that can take the knight, and the king has no moves. It's called smothered mate because the king is just stuck, cannot move. So it's smothered mate is really just done with knights most of the time, because so this is, there's not much to it. I would say this is a fairly rare checkmate, and it's usually used at more advanced levels, but this is just showing you what it is. So yeah, those are some of the basic checkmating patterns, and I will get on to the final segment of this video. So now let's say you watch through this video and you're like, okay, with this I could play chess, like I know what to do. So now what you really got to think about though is you got to look for threats, like what is the point of your opponent's moves. Usually in your head you can generate a basic plan now, but you want to figure out what your opponent's trying to do. So let's start e4, e5, knight to f3. So like you could think already, what is the point of this move? The point of this move is to attack this pawn. Hanging a pawn is already losing, so you'd want to play knight to c6, defending this pawn. You can also play d6 or f6, but I think knight to c6 is the best move here. They could play then bishop to e5, like what's the point of that? Once they take your knight, then you take back, because a knight is, you want to just take back, but then they will take your pawn, because if the bishop takes the knight, then it's no longer defending, so you could play d6, which then if they take your knight now, then you take back, then your pawn is not hanging because it is guarded by that pawn. So say knight to c3, just defending this pawn in the future. e6, this is just, so some moves you might play just to get pieces out, because the more pieces you move out of the way, the easier it is to castle. And I didn't really mention this in the first part, but castling is good to get your king out of the center. It's easier for more pieces to attack your king if they're in the center, so like you can attack from this side, you can attack with the bishop from here, you can get like a queen out, and then like this way. It's much easier to attack someone if they're in the center and out in the open. So moving some pieces you might want to move maybe because you have future plans to take this pawn, to go here if this bishop ever takes the knight, because if you go here after the bishop takes the knight, then white cannot castle, because for castling rules, if the king moves through the square that is being guarded, then you cannot castle through that. So anyway, that would be a good move in the potential future, so planning ahead is a good way to start. d3, maybe to prevent that, so the bishop can move out. At knight to f6, you're just adding pressure to this pawn. Bishop to e3, which is just, again, like looking for potential ways to move this bishop. This bishop has a nice scope, it can move anywhere down there, anywhere back here in the future. Bishop to e7, preparing to castle. Castles, knight to g5. This is attacking this bishop and maybe creating a threat over here, because this pawn, actually that pawn isn't that weak, but yeah. So attacking the bishop. Generally, you want to trade your knights off for the bishops, because bishops are usually more useful in more circumstances, because they can go long ranges and knights are just limited to very short range, and it takes them, especially in endgames, it takes a lot longer for knights to move than bishops to move. So generally try to trade off your knights for their bishops and protect your bishops from their knights, even though they're worth the same thing. So then you could play like bishop to g4, and then to prevent, so you could either move your queen, or you could just play f3, which attacks the bishop. So gotta move the bishop, bishop to d7. So also something is pawn structure, which means keeping all your pawns connected. So this is good, because if you double pawns, then I mean that can be good because you have an open file to potentially attack in the future. But then it's kind of weird, and these pawns can be targeted, like this pawn after bishop takes. That would be kind of weird to have there. It's harder to defend. So just usually you want to keep your pawns all open, I guess. So knight d5, again attacking this bishop. So usually probably want to, so knight to d4 maybe, attacking their bishop, and also offering a trade here. Knight can still take here, so knight takes e7 check, queen takes e7, because you got to make sure everything is guarded. Bishop takes d7, queen takes d7, f4. So now that looks like, okay, well maybe I can just trade this pawn. But you gotta be careful. So when looking at pieces, you gotta remember what is guarding what. If I take here, then you gotta think about it. Oh wait, now he can take my knight, because that pawn was guarding my knight. So you gotta look for things like that before just snap taking everything. A lot of beginners will do that, where there's like, oh, you're offering me a trade, okay, sure. But this is a poison pawn. So you gotta be careful about that. So yeah, so that's really all I'm gonna show for this, for like the looking for threats. So always make sure, tips is just to always make sure your pieces are defended. Look at where you're gonna move before you move, so don't just wildly hang a piece like, oh yeah, whatever looks like a good move, but then you gotta be careful that you aren't hanging a piece or hanging a fork or whatever. So look out for your opponent trying to do traps on you. And also look at what a piece is defending. So you're like, oh, this pawn is important. It's defending my knights, and my knight's being attacked. So in that case, if you take that pawn, then you just lose a knight. So, and you can also think, oh, what's guarding my knight? This is guarding my knight. It's perfectly safe. The rooks are guarding each other. The queen is not guarded, but it's very safe behind all these pawns and the knight and everything. So yeah, so just be careful about where you move, and I hope you found this video useful, and I hope you are able to apply the tactics I taught you in your future games. Hope you are successful in chess with these basic tactics, and I think that will be all for this video. Please like and subscribe, and I will try to get my next video out within a week.